we want to look at a little bit of the history of Catholic education in the country, and then secondly, what are we talking about when we speak of Catholic identity, huh? So, when I was writing my doctoral dissertation at Fordham in school administration, and as Father Andrew rightly pointed out, there was nothing Catholic about the program whatsoever. I had courses in public school law, public school finance, nothing whatsoever to do with Catholic education. At any rate, I had proposed as a dissertation topic the Supreme Court in Catholic schools. And you would have thought that I was asking to talk about the a four-headed monster. What's that all about? And one professor said, well, that's a rather inward-looking topic. Why don't you look outward? And I said, well, if we don't look inward, we ain't going to have any outward in 10 years' time, right? At any rate, I was given a very, very rough time about the topic, and that's something, if we had our usual social hours at the end of the evening, that's another thing that most of the priests will miss, that I could talk about that. But the first sentence in my dissertation says this: the first school within the territorial expanse of what is now the United States was a Catholic school. And my dissertation advisor said, I know you're enthusiastic about this Catholic school scene, but that's rather an exaggeration, isn't it? And he said, where? And I said, well, of course, if you have a very WASP understanding of American Catholic history, sure. I said, but the first school in what is now the United States was established by the Franciscans in Florida in 1606. All right, 1606. And I think we're not good at telling our own story. Right? We're so used to the immigrant mentality of an inferiority complex, always living in the shadow of bigger institutions and so-called older institutions, and our grandparents came here as penniless immigrants, and they were cleaning ladies and janitors and God knows what. Yeah, but it's a whole different story, right? If you look at the bigger picture. So some years ago, I was doing a teacher workshop in the Diocese of St. Augustine in Jacksonville, Florida. And it happened to be Catholic Schools Week. And the pastor said, would you like to celebrate the school mass tomorrow for Catholic Schools Week? And so I was very happy to do that. And at the beginning of the homily, I said to the kids, I hope you understand and appreciate how fortunate you are to be in a Catholic school, da, 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 da. I said, can anyone tell me where the first Catholic school in the United States was? And hands went up all over the church. And I called this little kid and he said, in our diocese, St. Augustine. Fourth grader, but he knew the history, all right? And he was very, very proud of the fact that he was in the diocese where the first Catholic school existed. Now, the opening of schools in all the Spanish territories was a pattern followed in California and New Mexico as the Franciscans sought to educate the children, and here's the story, it's not politically correct, but of both the colonists and the Native Americans, all right? And part of the story that's never told is that the Native Americans would have no language really to transmit for all practical purposes because it was not a written language, except for the Spanish and the French missionaries who articulated their verbal oral language and put it into written form, all right? So there's the Spanish colonization issue. The French opened the first school for boys in New Orleans in 1722, and that was done by the Capuchin friars. And the Ursuline nuns began a school for girls 5 years later. You see, by the way, in the history of the church, the minute the church pushed her way out of the catacombs, she did two things. She built churches and she opened schools everywhere. Why? Because that's part of what it means to be an incarnational religion. We take stuff seriously, huh? And so here, the thrust to open schools. And those schools of the French became prototypes for schools that sprang up along the St. Lawrence River, in St. Louis, Kaskaskia, Mackinac, Detroit, Vincennes, and Maine. And in Maine, where a Catholic school existed as early as 1640. 1640. In the British colonies, Catholics experienced relative freedom only in Maryland, and that's only as long as the Catholics ruled the colony, and in Pennsylvania. And it was in places like those that Catholic education began its development into the system that it is today. The groundwork laid during the colonial period served as the foundation for the massive Catholic educational effort that would flourish within 50 years of the ratification of the US Constitution. And much of what parochial schools became, and still are, came about through a series of events played out in New York City. The chief protagonist, some would call him antagonist, was Archbishop John J. Hughes, a fighting Irishman, who from 1840 to 1842 was embroiled in a heated controversy over Catholic children and their education. His first complaint centered on the overt anti-Catholicism in the so-called common schools. I should make a parenthesis here. At that time in American educational history, there was no such thing as an irreligious school. All schools were denominational schools: Presbyterian, Calvinist, Lutheran, Anglican, whatever. All of those common schools existed, and all of them were publicly funded. With the first wave of immigration at the end of the 19th century, particularly the Irish, to New York City, those so-called common schools were overtly anti-Catholic. You had the McGuffey reader. If you've ever seen one of our priests participating as a Father McGuffey, hope he doesn't take offense, but it was a reader that was used to teach children reading the English language. And as examples of various things, they would have anti-Catholic slurs, talking about the Pope's nose and all kinds of derogatory terms toward Catholic liturgy and clergy and religious as part of the instructional material for children. And so Archbishop Hughes objected to that. He was told, take a walk, mind your business. Go back to Ireland and take your immigrants with you. And again, this is the period of the nativists and the know-nothings, right? It's the period that also gave birth to those so-called Blaine amendments that the Supreme Court dealt with 2 weeks ago, finally. So he was then told, all right, we'll be nicer to your people, okay? And then, of course, part of the day was instruction in the Bible. And there's no reading of the Bible except in a context. And the context was not only Protestant, but virulently anti-Catholic. And so Archbishop Hughes objected to the reading of the Bible in the common schools. And he was joined in that project by Jews and atheists. And they actually got that out. It's ironic that a Catholic bishop is responsible initially for the removal of overt religious instruction in the public schools. And little by little, he kept pressing the case for his own schools. And he, although a foreign-born Irishman, he knew US constitutional doctrine very, very well. And so he asked for funding for St. Peter's School on Barclay Street, the church where Mother Seton was received into the Catholic faith. And he was told that's not possible. We can't aid sectarian institutions. By the way, whenever you hear that word sectarian attached to a school, that's already a signal that the person is of bad will. Sectarian always sounds bad, huh? It sounds divisive. If you want to use the proper language, it's religious schools, denominational schools, faith-based schools. But anyone says sectarian, you know you're heading for a difficulty. At any rate, they referred to his schools as sectarian. And Hughes said to the New York City Common School Board, I beg to differ. The Constitution does not require you to aid any religion, but if you do aid one, you must aid all. And they said, you know, the old codger, he knows what he's talking about. And so they said, you're right, you're right. And they declared all of those denominational schools public schools that continue to teach their own denominational branch of religion, and excluded the Catholic schools from it, because we were sectarian and they were common or public. And that is the beginning of the story that played out for the next 250 years, of having these institutions, and eventually, of course, one by one, these denominations lost control over those schools as well. And then you have the effectively so-called neutral public school that Pius XI condemned in Divini Elius Magistri, and now you have the complete secularization of education. But what Hughes did accomplish was he gained for the immigrants the right to operate and control their own schools. It came at a price, at a very, very heavy price. And so that penniless immigrants were building institutions and maintaining them. I always make the point that it tells you there's something very, very wrong in the contemporary church when institutions built by penniless immigrants cannot be maintained by the most affluent Catholic population in the history of the church, right? Our problem is not finances. Our problem is faith, right? My Ukrainian grandmother, who raised 3 children by herself in the Depression, was making $5 a week, and she gave $2 a week to the parish. $2 a week. And I would say to her, Grandma, how did you do it? She said, if we not do, who will do? Right? A sense of ownership, a sense of responsibility for the mission of the church, right? And today, you hear people who make 6 figures who proudly proclaim that they give $5 on Sunday. It's an embarrassment, okay? My pastor in junior high used to say, Catholics are for the birds. Cheap, cheap, cheap. Right? And we do have the lowest rate of giving of any faith group in the country, the cheapest, right? And our people still think, they say, Father talks about money too much. Well, if you gave it, we wouldn't have to talk about it, okay? Right? These are your institutions, this is what we need to be saying. At any rate, Hughes had a lot of one-liners that were very, very good. And one of his was this: the days have come in which the school is more necessary than the church. And what did he mean by that? People can worship in a variety of circumstances. You know, the Irish in the time of the persecution of the Brits, they're hedge masses, all right? You can worship anywhere. But the education of a generation is crucial to the continuing existence of that institution. Monsignor Batul is a sociologist by trade, and he can weigh in on this as well. And again, a point I made earlier, when you have a totalitarian government, the first thing they do is close down the denominational religious schools, not the churches, right? And so the critical importance of the schools, and Hughes saw that. However, and Hughes believed if he lost the children, there'd be no hope for a future for the church in this country. That's the point that I highlighted from Paul VI in his 1976 letter to the hierarchy of the United States. The strength of the church in the United States is in her schools. Now, Hughes was the greatest vocal proponent of all of this, but he was not the only voice on this. There were other bishops who were adamantly opposed to Catholic schools. Archbishop John Ireland of St. Paul, Minnesota, he wanted to use the public schools. And he even came up with what was called the Poughkeepsie Plan, whereby kids went to public school and then was, quote, release time that they would go out for a half hour or an hour a day to receive religious instruction and go back and be submitted to the government school system. But Ireland met with tremendous opposition from a number of bishops and also from the Holy See itself. But the most vocal opponent of Ireland was John Lancaster Spalding, the Bishop of Peoria. And he said, quote, "Without parish schools, there is no hope that the church will be able to maintain itself in America." Right? Now, unlike Hughes, who wanted government aid for the schools, Spalding said, "I want not a penny from the government, because the minute there's government money, there is government control." And again, tomorrow when we talk about various aid programs, we'll see how that we can negotiate that Scylla and Charybdis. And while it's true that the first Catholic school operated on this continent was as early as 1606, it took 2 centuries for those institutions to be organized into anything resembling a system. And it took a German-born Redemptorist, naturalized American citizen named John Neumann to accomplish that fact. As the 4th Bishop of Philadelphia, Neumann established a diocesan board of education, right, with clerical and lay representatives from every parish in the diocese. So we think this idea about involvement of lay people in administration of the school is unique. Neumann saw the necessity of that 150 years ago. He is rightly then called the father of parochial schools in America. When he became the Bishop of Philadelphia, his diocese was the entire state of Pennsylvania, southern New Jersey, and southern New York, right? Most of which he covered on horseback. And no wonder the poor man died at the age of, 46 or 48. But when he took over that diocese, there were 2 Catholic schools. And when he died, not even 15 years later, there were almost 100, right? And notice, by the way, it's important to realize, we didn't have parishes of 5,000, 6,000 families. We had parishes of a couple of hundred families at most, but they did what needed to be done, right? I always make the point, I find it fascinating that these little fundamentalist communities of 50, 75 families open schools and do it rather effectively. Or the Lefevrists, when they open a parish, one of the very first things they do is open a school. And they have tiny, tiny communities. And yet we've got suburban parishes of 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 families with 1,000 kids in CCD, and if you're lucky, 150, 200 kids in the parish school. Or worse, the parish school is closed entirely. And so once again, the question is not money, the question is a will. In 1892, Archbishop Patrick John Ryan was the Archbishop of Philadelphia, and he appointed a priest as the full-time diocesan superintendent of the schools. The first time in American church history to have a diocesan superintendent, right? I always tease Kevin that he needs to realize, though, that he has no real authority, that the authority over the parish school is the pastor, not the superintendent. And Kevin knows that and admits it very regularly, freely. And then Cardinal Doherty, who reigned gloriously in Philadelphia for 33 years, he established a system of free Catholic high schools. And that system prevailed in Philadelphia up to the mid-1970s, right? Philadelphia also had a very interesting policy, which probably prevailed until about 1980, and that was every newly ordained priest had to teach 5 years in a Catholic high school. His first assignment was in a Catholic high school. And to me, That's the best training possible. If you can relate to hormone-raging teenagers 5 days a week, you can do anything for the rest of your life. But also, what did that have the effect of doing? It was precisely these students were in day-to-day contact, as our parents mentioned in the first sessions this evening. They were in day-to-day contact with kids. And guess what? This is an automatic road to vocation promotion. Right? That's still pretty much the policy in the Diocese of Lincoln, Nebraska. And so you have a high school in Lincoln, like Pius X, that has, I think, something like 10 priests on the faculty, right? And guess what? They continue to have boys going into college seminary right out of those high schools of theirs. Right? This is not rocket science. And those, and by the way, with Cardinal Doherty, if schools were an absolute priority for him, and on his watch, he had the vision, the foresight to realize there would be people eventually moving out of the cities into what was either rural or suburbia. And he established parishes there, and the first building to go up for any parish was the school. He was famous. They tell the story that on a Monday morning, he'd call a priest and say, "Father, what are you doing this afternoon?" Well, nothing. Nothing? Well, I mean, nothing if you want me to do something. Well, we're going to go for a ride in the country. And he would arrive at 1 o'clock and pick up the priest, and they'd take a ride up to Bucks County on the border of New Jersey, the Delaware River. And at a certain point, he'd tap the head of the chauffeur and say, "Pull over." And he'd say, "Father, come out here." And they'd be in the middle of a big cornfield. And he'd say, "The school, the convent, the church," some years later, the rectory. And the priest would say, "But Bishop, Your Eminence, there's nobody here." "No, you come and they'll follow." And most of the parishes of that county were built in that fashion, built and paid for even before the buildings were occupied, right? But a man of tremendous vision. And the schooling issue was of such a priority to him that if a pastor refused to build a school, the pastor was removed as pastor, right? He made it eminently clear. This is a priority for us. And those strong organizational beginnings in New York and Philadelphia spread throughout the country so that American Catholics could boast of the largest privately sponsored school system in the world by the 1950s and the 1960s. And then, of course, the bottom fell out. So that's the historical picture. We'll move next then into the issue of identity, but so we don't fragment ourselves, any questions on the historical front or observations? That's not beer, that's ginger ale. Okay, now, Catholic identity. If we ain't authentically Catholic, we have no reason to exist, and parents have every right to sue us for fraud, right? And if we couldn't be convicted of being an authentically Catholic school, we need to be ashamed. I find it perversely amusing with the Catholic college situation in this country that, for 45 years and more, most of these institutions could never, ever be convicted of Catholicism, right? In fact, they did a survey of freshmen at Georgetown University 3 years ago, freshmen, about the month of October or November, and 82% of the freshmen said they were shocked to discover that Georgetown was a Catholic university. Right? There was nothing remotely to suggest the Catholicity of the institution. Now, we have to make sure that can never be said of our grade schools and our high schools, all right? Those mistakes were made at the university level. Thank you to that infamous Land of Lakes document from 1967. But at the parochial level, at the diocesan level, we still have the ability to maintain or to increase the Catholic identity of our institutions. There's a wonderful book that I recommend to faculties always, and I think it's a good book for a pastor, first of all, to read himself. One of the other hats I wear is as the publisher of Newman House Press. And about, I guess it must be 15 years ago now, let me see. I don't even see a date. Oh yes, 2005, yeah, 15 years ago. We published a book by Professor Curtis Hancock, who teaches at the Jesuit University in Kansas City. And it's called Recovering a Catholic Philosophy of Elementary Education. And when we published this, we were told that it was the first book of Catholic educational philosophy in English in 45 years, which tells you the mess that we found ourselves in. But what Dr. Hancock does, he takes, well, each chapter, for example, what do we mean by a Catholic philosophy of elementary education? The aims of Catholic education, lessons from our history. The child is a human person. To educate is to habituate. Confronting the idols of the education tribe. And then a great reading list. And at the end of every chapter, there are discussion questions. And what I recommend always is that faculties, that a school purchase these books for all their teachers. And this is available on our Newman House Press website. And that they take a chapter a month to read as a faculty, and at one faculty meeting a month, discuss that chapter. And what it helps them do is identify their own philosophy of life, and then secondly, what flows from that, or should flow from that, their philosophy of education. There needs to be a consistency between the two, huh? So for example, if you say to me, I'm a hang loose kind of guy, I don't believe in regulations, and I think people ought to do whatever they do whenever they want to do it, and I walk into your classroom and children are chained to their desks, there's obviously a disconnect between your stated philosophy of life and your practice of an educational philosophy. And so this book helps a teacher, a faculty, to identify one's philosophy of life and therefore philosophy of education. And what teachers often say about this is they're amazed at how they have imbibed unconsciously a very worldly, secular philosophy of life. It's in the air. People breathe it in all the time. And it's only when you put it under a microscope that you say, wow, there really is a problem with this. And this is something that I think is prime material for a priest to be doing with his school faculty. So once a month, you read that chapter and you lead the faculty in ongoing teacher formation, discussing the issues in that particular chapter. That's part of your responsibility for what the Vatican documents all talk about, the ongoing formation of Catholic school teachers. Secondly, our Catholic Education Foundation, about 8 years ago, came up with a Catholic identity assessment instrument. If you ask any Catholic school administrator, any pastor, you say, what's the Catholic identity of your school? 90% of them say, oh, it's wonderful, it's wonderful. Right? But again, it has to be examined. Huh? You know, who was it that said the unexamined life is not worth living, right? Socrates. And so a pastor of a very, very good school in Texas, I asked him if we could pilot our program in his school. And he said, yeah, sure. He said, but I can tell you, you know, our school is as Catholic as the 13th century. You know, I don't think there's much room for improvement there. And when we did the assessment instrument, and he read the results, he said, It's amazing what you don't see until you're made to see it. And so how does this initiative work? There are 3 levels to it, and these are separate entities, really. The first phase is the entire faculty sit down one afternoon for about an hour and go through a very, very detailed questionnaire. It's anonymous, it's done through SurveyMonkey, and it probes every aspect of the life of the school. I'll give you some examples in a bit. But it's everybody who's involved in the school enterprise: administration, faculty, support staff. Someone said to me one time, well, who cares about, who's slinging the macaroni and cheese on Friday in the cafeteria? Well, the point is that everyone in a Catholic school is a teacher of the faith. By the way that person slings the macaroni and cheese, all right? But one of the reasons that we insisted on everybody on staff doing this was the priest who worked with me on producing this instrument had worked as a seminarian in a high school, and he said, bar none, the most popular man in this high school, it was an all-boys high school, the most popular man on campus was the old janitor who had been there for 35, 40 years. And he said, we all presumed that the reason for his popularity was he was a grandpa figure. A lot of these kids didn't have that luxury of a grandpa near them or even existing. And he said, well, then I got ordained and I went back to that school. And as I started to hear confessions, I discovered why the old janitor was so popular. Every afternoon after school, he would meet certain boys in the locker room and provide them with a supply of free condoms. All right? The Catholic identity of the school was not a problem stemming from the administration or the faculty. It was a 65-year-old janitor, right, who had absolutely no moral compass whatsoever. And so that's why we say everybody is involved with this. The other point with this, so we gather all of this data, and then we collate it and hand it back as an anecdotal report. Here's what you said about yourselves. And on the basis of what you have said about yourselves, we then provide input, either praising what's there or suggesting need for improvement in particular ways. And so it's interesting that that survey has a number of side effects. In one parish, the pastor, when I asked him why he wanted to do this, and he said, it's my first pastorate. I'm all for the school, but I think there are a couple of weak links in the faculty. And I want to identify that, and I don't want this to go on for my second year here. And so he ended up, we did the survey, and it was in January, and we usually have a turnaround about 3 weeks, 2 weeks to get the data back. And it was the April meeting of the faculty, and he attended every faculty meeting. And he said, by the way, next month, I'll have the contracts ready for those that we're inviting back for next year. And at the end of the meeting, 3 teachers went up to him and they said, Father, by the way, if you were thinking about offering us a contract, we're not going to be coming back next year. And he kind of played dumb and he said, oh, and why would that be? And they said, that survey that we had to take, we don't like the direction that seems to suggest you're going to be taking. So there's a self-selecting process. In fact, they were precisely the 3 teachers that he intended to get rid of. And I said to him, well, I hope you're going to give us an extra bonus because we saved you 3 lawsuits, all right? But it's interesting, people perceive something in that process, all right? So asking the questions already suggests answers. So that's the first phase. If a school is interested, then we do an on-site visitation. That's a second level. And I'll go to a school, depending on the size, for 3 days, 4 days, whatever. Visit classrooms, meet with department chairmen, meet with the counseling department, the school administration, if there's a board of pastors, if there's an alumni organization, a parents group, a financial board, all of that, student council. And then I produce a report. So we had level A, what you said about yourselves. Now, here's what I observed. And let's put these two together and see how they merge. And then we identify what we would call needy areas. And that's for level 3, that the faculty, that the administration would want us to come back and do a workshop then for their faculty on these areas that need improvement, right? So that's been a very, very successful program.
Nice.
We've done that in a number of dioceses. I think it's probably about at least 30 right now. So, and sometimes an entire diocese. So Gaylord, Michigan, we did all of the schools there. Los Angeles, we did all the high schools. But then individual places or sections in other dioceses. But again, that should be uploaded for you on our program here. So what are some of the areas that we cover? The general questionnaire is just sort of just generic demographic information about the school. Hiring and recruitment policies. So we know that the famous mantra in business is what? Personnel is policy, all right? You can have the finest pastor and the finest principal, but if you have teachers that don't buy into the program, it's useless, right? It's not going to go anywhere. And the spiritual life of the school, the whole question about who teaches religion and what kind of religion is taught, what's the curriculum, and again, you know, the Catholic notion of a curriculum is everything is tied together, right? You know, our word university, you know, comes from the Latin unus and versus, everything turned toward the one, right? And so there's this whole spoke, this whole wheel rather, and at the center is the person and message of Jesus Christ, and every aspect of the curriculum is a spoke in that wheel. But ultimately, everything leads to Christ. If you had been on the campus of Seton Hall this week, if you went to visit the science building, which is there's a frieze on what used to be the front wall. There's now another wall in front of it because they built an extension. But it's the creation of the world in stone, and with God the Father in the act of creation. And all of the sciences, geology and botany and physics and chemistry and so forth, all leading back to Christ, the Omega point, right? A wonderful, wonderful lesson in stone as to the nature of religion and science. Extracurricular activities, because what we do off time as a school says what we are as a school as well. You know, what's the behavior of our students at games? What are the expectations of our team members, of our coaches? Disciplinary policies. Are they fair? Are they consistent? Is there, you know, policy A if, you know, a kid comes from parents with money or prestige, or, you know, is discipline meted out according to whim? You know, a teacher in a bad mood. I remember a kid coming to my office one day, and I said, what are you here for? And he said, Mr. So-and-so sent me to you. I said, for what? He said, I don't know. I said, well, remember our policy. if you don't know, there's one detention for being stupid, and then there's a second detention for the offense. What did you do? And he said, I don't know. He said, he just exploded. And he said, and I said to him, who spit in your cornflakes today? Right? Well, I went and saw the teacher later in the day, and he said, well, he's out of control. I said, no, Mike, the problem is you've been out of control for 4 months of the school year. I've heard the racket in the hallway walking past your classroom, and now you exploded today. There's something wrong with the discipline, okay? And discipline has to be consistently meted out by an individual teacher and by all teachers, okay? So they know that they can't get away with doing something in this room, and that teacher is pitted against that teacher. Right? So, and again, that's part of, discipline is part of Christianity, right? Disciplina is with discipulus, what it means to be a student, all right, is to engage in the act of discipline, right? There are certain things that are necessary for a cohesive, unified environment. And that also is in terms of academic standards. Not that this is an easy A here and this, who cares what's going on there. What's the relationship of this school to the greater community? So what's its relationship to the parish? What's its relationship to the town in which you're located? Right? What kind of a reputation does the school have in the town? In one of my high schools, the sister who ran the business department went around to business leaders and asked for business equipment for the business department. And one of the men said, well, what does your Catholic high school have to do with me and my business? She said, we're going to be sending our people, you're going to want our students to be, our graduates to be working in your business. Oh. And she got new equipment every year from these institutions. So our relationship, our reputation. In one institution, I had a call from the local department store on a Monday morning, and the secretary said, Mr. So-and-so is on from the Bon Marché, which is sort of the West Coast version of Macy's. And you know, when you're an administrator and you get a call on a Monday morning from the cops or a business, you figure, what the heck did one of my kids do over the weekend? And so I got on the phone and he said, Father, he said, I'm Joe Schmo, and I'm wondering if you would be willing to send out a notice that we're looking for students to work this summer in our department store. And I said, oh, are you sending that to all of the high schools in the city? And he said, oh, God, no. And by the way, he was a Mormon bishop as well as as the owner of the store. And I said, oh, why not? And he said, you've got to be kidding. I said, well, why do you want our kids? He said, well, I know that they'll be courteous, they'll be respectful, they know how to dress, they can read and write, and I don't think they'll be stealing stuff from the store. And I said, well, I think you're right on all of that. I said, would you be willing to write me a letter to that effect? And then I'll be happy to promote it. And he sent me the letter. I photocopied it, sent it to all our parents. It hit the secular newspaper the next day. All hell broke loose in the city because the owner of the Bon Marché didn't take seriously the public schools in the city. They were grossly offended by it. Well, whose fault is that, huh? But my point being, what's your reputation? And remember also that the reputation of the school is the reputation of the church, right? That is an extension, and a very important extension, of the mission and the mandate of the parish or of the diocese. So then when we talk about identity, how do you identify or quantify Catholic identity? And you remember that goofy Supreme Court justice was Potter Stewart, who said about pornography, I can't define it, but I know it when I see it, right? Well, we can say much the same thing about Catholic identity of a school. Yeah, there is a checklist, sure. crucifix in classroom, statue of Our Lady, begin class with a prayer, so forth. Okay, that's all very good, very nice. But there's more to it than that. There's a feel. You walk into the institution and you know that you're on sacred territory, all right? As a priest, when I visit a school, as a, quote, stranger, I can always tell about the serious level of Catholic identity and priestly involvement by one thing. When I walk through a corridor, do kids say, "Hi, Father, good morning, Father," right? And I said this to one principal. I said, "You know, your kids here don't," he said, "Oh, well, because you're a stranger." I said, I said, in the Catholic community, no priest is ever a stranger. None is ever a stranger. And I said, I walk down the streets of New York City week after week, and garbage collectors, hookers, drug addicts, Wall Street executives all say, "Hi, Father." I said, if that's going on the streets of New York, and it's not going on in a Catholic school, there's something grossly amiss. It means, number one, there's a lack of a priestly presence. Kids don't know how to relate to a priest. And secondly, they've not been introduced to the Catholic culture, which is, again, an integral part of Catholic identity. So it's not enough to teach the catechism. Yes, it's critically important to teach the catechism. But we have an entire Catholic culture, right? Literature, music, art, architecture, all of that is part of our patrimony. And if we're not conveying that to our children, that's really child abuse, okay? It's failing to give them what is their right, their baptismal right, their baptismal inheritance, all right? They should be getting all of that in our schools. They also, unfortunately today, we have to start making sure that there are other issues that are dealt with. But was it 2 years ago? Yeah, 1 year ago, the Holy See, the Congregation for Catholic Education, came out with a document, Male and Female, He Created Them, towards a path of dialogue on the question of gender theory in education. We need to have that. That's critically important, that our institutions are aware of this. And again, in our school policy handbooks, in our policy of admissions, all of these issues need to be handled in advance, not last minute. The last minute stuff doesn't work. It doesn't work legally, especially. The Cardinal Newman Society also produced a very helpful document called Human Sexuality Policies for Catholic Schools. Human Sexuality Policies for Catholic Schools. I think that should also be available for you if you upload that. And it tells you what you need to have documented, again, in your teacher contracts, in your expectations of families that enroll their children in our schools, etc. All right. And the last thing I would mention at this point is a comment of Thomas Merton, the great Trappist monk, convert, poet, who unfortunately went kind of loony toward the end of his life. But his most famous work, of course, is his spiritual autobiography, Seven Story Mountain. And he has 4 paragraphs in that book on his boyhood. His parents were sort of hippies before they were hippies. And he grew up in 4 or 5 different countries, I think. And at one point, the family was living in southern France between the 2 world wars. And of course, neither he nor his parents were even Christians. But he has these comments about Catholic education. When I think of the Catholic parents who sent their children to a school like that, meaning the state school in that village, I began to wonder what was wrong with their heads. Down by the river, in a big, clean, white building, was a college in France means high school, college run by the Marist fathers. I had never been inside it. Indeed, it was so clean, it frightened me. But I knew a couple of boys who went to it. They were sons of the little lady who ran the pastry shop opposite the church of Saint Antonin, and I remember them as exceptionally nice fellows, very pleasant and good. How unlike the products of the state school were they? When I reflect on all this, I am overwhelmed at the thought of the tremendous weight of moral responsibility that Catholic parents accumulate upon their shoulders by not sending their children to Catholic schools. Those who are not of the church have no understanding of this. They cannot be expected to. As far as they can see, all this insistence on Catholic schools is only a money-making device by which the church is trying to increase its domination over the minds of men and its own temporal prosperity. And of course, most non-Catholics imagine that the church is immensely rich and that all Catholic institutions make money hand over fist, and that all that money is stored away somewhere to buy gold and silver dishes for the Pope and cigars for the College of Cardinals. Is it any wonder that there can be no peace in a world where everything possible is being done to guarantee that the youth of every nation will grow up absolutely without moral and religious discipline and without the shadow of an interior life or of that spirituality and charity and faith which alone can safeguard the treaties and agreements made by governments? Now remember, this is between the two world wars. And Catholics, he says, thousands of Catholics everywhere have the consummate audacity to weep and complain because God does not hear their prayers for peace when they have neglected not only his will, but the ordinary dictates of natural reason and prudence, and let their children grow up according to the standards of a civilization of hyenas. A civilization of hyenas. And if he was saying that about France in 1925, what in God's name would he say about the United States in 2020? So I would say those are my runoff reflections on both history and identity. And I think Brother Owen has some insights that he probably wants to share with us at this point. Huh?
Yes. Thank you very much, Father, and fellow attendees at the conference. I just want to share 4 or 5 areas of response to Father Stravinskas' talk. First of all, I think all of us that know Father Stravinskas realize that his reflections are the fruit of a lifetime's devotion to Catholic education. And his breadth of understanding of details is matched only by his depth of insight. And there were 5 areas I would like to highlight that I think are extremely valuable in what Father calls attention to. And the first is the sense of Catholic history and the responsibility of Catholic history. And what I take away from Father Peter's comments are knowledge of Catholic history highlights, above all, the virtues of Catholic leadership at all levels of the educational life, the virtues of leadership. For example, in Father Peter's talks, he identifies not only the ancient tradition of the schools in the United States, going back to St. Augustine and other places. And of course, to me, it was heartrending to see some of the damage being done at the California missions, because in a real sense, it's a history that reaches back even beyond the founding of this nation. And there was a Catholic presence there. But to my first point is that knowledge of that history gives you a confidence that you can identify leadership. And I would suggest that the thing that is necessary is a will, an informed will, and leadership today to articulate the Catholic identity in education and at all levels, and to promote it with great courage in the face of a very determined opposition. So the mentioning of Bishop Hughes, Bishop Neumann, Bishop Spalding, and Cardinal Doherty, all of these people, these great Catholic leaders, we have a responsibility to have contact with them primarily because of our shared faith and our baptism. Not that they are just significant figures in American cultural history, but because they share our baptism. They stood in the breach at a time and articulated the needs of the church with great leadership and courage in the face sometimes of determined opposition. And that's the first thing that struck me about Father Peter's talk, how desperately we need that kind of leadership, and perhaps how desperately we need to re-educate ourselves about our own Catholic history. The second point that I was deeply impressed was the way in which Father Peter's talk moved from the level of historical reflection to the practical instrument of the tool of assessment about which he spoke, of the questionnaire, the on-site visit, and the identity of needs in areas in schools. And as Father Peter indicated, this has been applied in 30 dioceses across the country and probably many other places. Leadership leads to, it seems to me, the second point that I drew from Father Peter's talk is practical application of tools that you test out. And how important is it for us to have that connection between the historical and the practical in terms of how we can do the very best that we can to strengthen and support all of our efforts in promoting Catholic education through the schools. And that was, to me, the second point. The third point was the key relationship between the identity of Catholic schools and the priestly presence in Catholic schools. I'll have more to say to that in my own talk, because I think this is one of the most interesting features about the two documents from the Vatican document of 1965, Gravissimum Educationis, 1965, and then the document on the Catholic schools in 1977. There are only two mentions. The word priest is mentioned twice in the documents. And I think that's something that, the third point I got from Father Peter's talk, the importance of finding ways, practical ways, of encouraging and promoting the priestly presence in the school. Now, I'm sure we'll discuss some of this later when we spoke about the effort that we made in the seminary this past year to include as part of the ministry work of the students, going out on their ministry, that we had several of the students working in one of our Catholic high schools for their ministry. And we can perhaps talk more about other ways that this can be done. The fourth point that Father Peter touched on also was the importance of treasuring a Catholic culture. And he mentioned in music and art, literature, and this to me is a very, very important factor that in my own reflections on having grown up in the era of what I would call the demise to a great extent of the Catholic school system, the tremendous cultural loss, and in some ways an irreparable damage done. And I think that is a lesson as important as the history, and in a certain sense it's the other side of the coin of an appreciation of Catholic history, is the rich cultural treasure. It seems to me that in terms of the entire common good of this country, we're going into an area where there is an enormous cultural impoverishment. And to me, the wholesale destruction of the monuments and so forth may be a terrible sign of a kind of cultural cataclysm that's just hovering on the horizon. And the final example was the wonderful reference to Thomas Merton. And Merton's reference about Catholic schools and Catholic literature, to me, illustrates an important point. I was not a great big fan of Thomas Merton in the 60s. I'll be very frank with you, because I thought he had become a bit knocked off center, became a kind of, crypto-Marxist or whatever else it was. But still the point is, the wonderful lesson that Father Peter drew out from Merton's comments were rich for points of meditation.
Yeah.
So those areas I thought were extremely important and have a great deal of bearing on what we can learn from this conference as it goes forward. So thank you very much.
Thank you, brother. Any questions or comments, observations?
I'd like to say, Bishop Kennedy here.
Yes.
Oh,
I'm sorry I can only give you my ceiling, but
it's a beautiful ceiling, though. It really is.
but I've been listening very carefully, and I think these are all points that are very, very important. I think, however, we are at a crucial time. So before Father Peter began his conversation, we were talking about the crisis of the present time. Crisis of the present time, we see, has to do with everything regarding education, the universities, the high schools, grammar schools, everything. So we are at a point in time in which the Catholic Church tradition needs to figure out how is it going to find a way to articulate itself within the present context regarding what are the issues that we have to deal with in relationship to the culture, the church, the modernity, and so on and so forth. I think, but I'm surprised not to hear about Christopher Dawson. Christopher Dawson and Bruno Schlesinger at the University of St. Mary in Notre Dame provided a way to show how the issue of the historicity of Catholicism, that is indeed the importance of the incarnation in the way in which the church finds itself and is capable of manifesting the way in every single moment within the way in which the development of the church's history has included the capacity to be able to provide the kind of dynamism that each child, for example, has. Maria Montessori did this brilliantly. Lonergan did it in another way, in a very important way. And Dawson did it in the context of the creation of a history of Catholic culture. And I think, for example, the new textbook series that are coming out for the Catholic schools begin to provide this kind of context of which a knowledge for the students is very important, in which they can come to understand the unfolding of the tradition in all of its details. I think what is needed is something in seminaries that would allow people who are studying to be priests, who are supposed to be the people capable of guiding those who are under their care, under their pastoral care, and especially in the organization of parish schools, the importance of the way in which a Catholic education can be reassembled in a way that allows the introduction to the integration of the historicity and of the unfolding of the understanding of the dynamism of faith has taken place and continues to take place within people who are still undergoing the crisis of the present time. I think we are at a very important moment, and I think we need to make sure that the priests who are being taught in the seminaries are being taught how they have the responsibility of helping them. We have the responsibility of helping them to understand the unfolding of the history of the dynamism of the church and the dynamism of faith over time, and that they become the guides and leaders of helping the teachers in schools to find the ways to address the important things that will allow the teachers to become authentic mediators of the tradition which they are supposed to represent.
Very well said, Bishop.
Great. Bishop Kennedy, for many years, was involved with the very wonderful Catholic Studies program at the University of St. Thomas and St. Paul. So, and I think you can hear echoes of that whole cultural phenomenon and thrust in his remarks. Any other observations? I should mention about two of our participants that have an interesting background. Monsignor Shadle, ironically, was the first lay principal in the Archdiocese of Indianapolis. And after that, went into the seminary, became a priest, and ended up vicar general of the diocese. So he's got an angle on, and now is pastor of a very large, successful parish school. And he, excuse me. So he has an interesting perspective as a lay teacher in a Catholic school, and then as a pastor of a parish in a Catholic school. Father Dennis McManus, who teaches at Mount St. Mary Seminary in Emmitsburg, Maryland, he has taught as a religious brother, a layman, and a priest. So he's covered all three canonical categories in himself. And so again, he brings an interesting dimension to the whole education issue, and we'll hear from him in our next session. So before we take a break, any other opportunities to talk about either the history or the identity? And, you know, and these topics are not mutually exclusive. These are not hermetically sealed capsules that, you know, we're not going to talk about identity now for the next 2 days. We certainly will, all right? But in terms of a more ad rem approach. Okay, so we're 10 minutes early, which is really good. So let's come back at 9 o'clock rather than 9:15, and that will be our seminarian panel. And Brother Owen and Father McManus will be a part of that project as well. So 9 o'clock Eastern time.